Okay, so next on our list is to fix this submit issue so that when we do submit, we actually redirect afterwards. And let's head back into VS Code so that we can take care of this. And in our activity form, what we want to do is head down to our handle submit, and after our create activity has completed, we then want to redirect the user to the new activity that's been created or to the activity that's been edited. And what we can do is use the len callback and say history dot push, and I'm not seeing this in the list, so we need to bring in history into our properties. So we've got the match, and let's also add the history object as well. And this should give us access to the push. And here it is, and we can use this and say /, and we actually need to make these backticks and then say / and activities $, and then we can use the new activity.id because this is the one we're generating on the client, so therefore we've got access to it inside here as well, and we can say new activity.id, and we can do the same thing for our edit activity and say .len and say history.push and backticks and / activities $, and we can use activity.id in this case. And let's go and check this is working. So I'll just refresh the page. And if I make another change and click submit, we should find ourselves redirected back to our activity. But I just want to open the console logs and just repeat that behavior, because what we see inside here, and these logs are getting really busy with warnings, and we'll certainly clean these up very shortly because we've got a missing dependency and we've got a whole bunch of stuff that we're not using. But we'll deal with all of this very shortly. But what we do have is something in red, and we can't ignore things that are in red in our console. And what's going on here? It's telling us it can't perform a React state update on an unmounted component. This is a no-op, but it indicates a memory leak in our application. Now this is actually quite a common error. And if we take a look at our code, let's see what's going on here. Now, what we're doing in our useEffect method is we are setting states inside here. And this was no problem. This wouldn't have caused us any errors with what we're doing so far. But the problem occurs when we're submitting our form after editing. And when we submit our form after editing, list load activity is being called. And if we go and take a look, and let's just go to our MobX developer tools, and I'm just going to click on edit again, and I'll make a small change, and then I'll click submit. And what we see is two calls to loading the activity and clearing the activity. Now, one of the load activities will have been for the simple fact that we've gone to our activity details page, but another one of the load activities is coming from the fact that our load activity method is being called again after we've edited and submitted our activity. Now, what's going on here is we're only checking to see if we could use this method if the match.params ID is available. And because we're redirecting after we've edited, then this is causing a change to those params. And because in our useEffect method, if this property changes, then this method is called again. And even though we don't want to call it again at this stage, it is being called again. But because our component is len unmounted, it's calling, or it's trying to call this set activity on a component that is len unmounted. So what we really need to do is add another check inside here to prevent this from being called when we're submitting our activity for editing. And one of the things we can do is we can check to see if our activity has an ID of length greater than 0. and use that as a second check inside our if statement here. And the reason for that is when we do load an activity and we have an activity set inside here, then this will prevent this from ever being called again whilst we still have an activity in our state. It'll also just prevent it from being called when we're creating an activity, but this one is already taking care of that because we don't have an ID parameter when we create an activity. So if we add another check and we say if match.params.id and the activity.id.length is equal to 0, then we'll load the activity. And what this should do is fix our other problem as well, because if we do have an activity inside our activity store, then it's not going to meet these conditions, therefore list will not run, and this won't be attempted to be called when we've already unmounted our component. So let's go and make sure this has had the desired effect. And if I just go back to the console again and just refresh the page and click on Edit, and I'll just make another change. I'll just take out some of these 2s and click on Submit. We now find that we submit our changes, our activity is updated, and we don't see that particular error. And while I'm here, I'm just going to deal with a couple of these React hook warnings about missing dependencies. We've got a match.params.id in our activity details that's missing, and also in our activity form we didn't add the activity.id.length. So let's just go ahead and add those in as dependencies. And this is something that's so easy to forget to do, but React is so helpful in telling us what we've forgotten that it's not really a major concern. And because this activity is not available at this point, we need to remove the use effect below our use state method, and that should work just fine. And I'll just go back and make sure nothing's broken, and click on Edit, add a number, click on Submit, and that works fine. And I'll just do the same thing for the activity details as well, and we'll head back here and add our match.params.id. Now one day React says that our compilers are going to be advanced enough so that we don't need to worry about adding these dependencies, and I personally am looking forward to that day because I find it ridiculously easy to forget to add dependencies into this use effect hook. But I don't worry about forgetting because the console logs are going to tell us when we're missing something. Now we're going to have a big cleanup very shortly and deal with all of these, but there's one more thing I want to cover in the routing section, and that's our home components. What I want to do is move this outside of our navbar so that our home page is really just a standalone home page. And there's one more thing I want to cover as well, because when I went onto this page I didn't even see the h1 tag, and that's because React Router unusually doesn't accommodate scrolling back to the top when we change our routes. And if I scroll down to the bottom of my activity list and then click on the home page, well, we're not at the top of our page. So there's two things I want to address before we clean up all of our unused code, and it's moving our home page outside of the navbar and also dealing with the scrolling issue so that when we do navigate to another page, we're at the top of that page rather than halfway down. And we'll look at both of those coming up.